Hey everybody, this is your Digital Super Saiyan 3 back here with another video. And superheroes have often or not gotten so many reboots. We've seen many well-known superheroes get their reboots. And one of them is Spider-Man. And what I'm talking about, 2012's The Amazing Spider-Man. Directed by Mark Webb, starring Andrew Garfield, Emma Stone, Rhys Ifans, Sally Field, Dennis Leary, and Martin Sheen. Honestly, I went and saw this film back in 2012 because, of course, since I knew it was a new Spider-Man movie, I was going to see it anyway because I love Spider-Man. And so, that is why I also got this baby, and with all the different Spider-Man movies on it, which is the first 6 films, since I got that back in 2018. But what I'm here to talk about is The Amazing Spider-Man itself, and not Amazing Spider-Man 2. This is mainly the first movie I'm talking about. So, Amazing Spider-Man 1 from 2012. We start off with meeting young Peter Parker as he's playing hide-and-go-seek with his best friend. Or imaginary friends, since Peter was playing hide-and-go-seek with imaginary friends. Or with an imaginary friend of his. Anyway, while stumbling into his dad's study, he calls his father in. And his father begins realizing that the window is open, and he decides to take his research, since his father was a scientist in this version instead of a spy, and him and his wife would leave, leaving Peter in the custody and care of his aunt and uncle. Many years later, Peter grows up into Andrew Garfield. Now in this version, they gave Peter a skateboard in this version. Yeah, Peter Parker in this version is a skateboarder. Yeah, he still does photography, but he also likes to skateboard. He's still a loser in school, though. We do see him get beaten up by Flash Thompson, and then Gwen Stacy, played by Emma Stone, breaks it up after Peter stumbled upon Flash bullying a kid, and Flash wanted Peter to take the picture, but Peter refused, so Flash beat him up. While at home, Peter basically tries to help his uncle with fixing a leak in the basement. But while doing so, he ends up stumbling upon a briefcase belonging to his father. As well as a picture of a colleague of his father. And yes, his father in this version worked with Dr. Curtis Connors, in this version played by Rhys Ifans. So, the next day, Peter goes to Oscorp. And at Oscorp, Peter sneaks in as part of an intern group. And, of course, he leaves the group after following one of Oscorp's executives, who had a file with the same kind of algorithm that Peter saw in the briefcase, in the file with the briefcase in it. So, Peter goes into the same room by doing the same exact thing by accessing the panel that the executive was using, and he goes inside. And inside, he sees a whole bunch of spiders where, guess what? When he strummed one of the spider's webs, a bunch of spiders fell on him. But one spider manages to latch onto him and bites him. Gwen also was working for Oscorp in this version. So, On the ride back home, Peter, on the train heading back to Queens, well, well, we see his powers start to kick in as he gets into a fight accidentally on the train. And after a guy put his beer bottle on Peter's head, Peter gets up after being startled, thanks to the spider sense. The beer spilled on a girl's shirt. Peter's hand gets sticky to the girl's shirt, and one of the guys, and the guy who started the fight with Peter said, "Get your hand off of her." Peter said, "I'm trying," but he isn't able to get his hands off of her. He just rips the shirt off of the girl's body, and then the fight breaks out, and Peter quickly takes these guys out. I mean, especially, he didn't mean to start that fight, and that was an accident. And yeah, when he gets home, he begins hoarding and taking a whole bunch of food up to his room. Seeing the most unusual behavior that Aunt May and Uncle Ben see in their nephew. And then, the next day, Peter destroys his bathroom. And even destroys the keyboard on his computer, when a few of the keys get stuck to his fingers. Soon he decides to pay Connors a visit to his home. And Peter gives Connors the formula. Yeah, he just gives Connors the formula. After Connors talked about how and why how he basically stayed away from his family. So moving on. So Connors invites Peter to Oscorp Tower the next day. But at school, when Peter humiliates Flash in a game of basketball, and while dunking a basketball, he destroys the backboard. Of course, that gets Peter in trouble, and his uncle yells at him and says, "Thanks to this little escapade of yours, I gotta change shifts at work." And then Gwen comes by, and then Uncle Ben says, "He's got you on his computer." Yeah, and then after Ben left, Peter and Gwen flirt for a bit. They flirt for a bit. Then Peter goes and skateboards off. He is like, we see this montage of Peter skateboarding at the docks and him chain swinging from these chains in this warehouse. And we even see Peter wall crawl for the first time as well. So that's pretty cool. We got to see Peter wall crawl for the first time in this movie. But yeah, it is what it is in this version. I mean, I get it. They didn't want to be completely doing the same thing Sam Raimi did with his reboot, or with his movie that he made back in 2002. So, at Oscorp, Peter and Connors get to work on the serum. And after so many different pending errors and the subject being deceased, finally after one more try, the two manage to make it work. And then they inject Freddy and Wilma, the three-legged mice, with the serum. However, Peter was late coming home, and of course, an argument with Uncle Ben ensued, because Peter was supposed to pick up his aunt, and because he forgot to pick his aunt up, that led to an argument between Ben and Peter. Peter walks off, and Ben goes after him, even though Aunt May says, Ben, just let him go cool down. But Ben doesn't. He just goes after his nephew instead of just giving his nephew a time to cool off. So, yeah, the next thing you know, Peter goes to a convenience store and tries to buy himself a chocolate milk. But because he wasn't able to afford his milk, the clerk says, "What, did Daddy not give you enough milk money today?" Yeah, and then, of course, Peter encounters a man who then just takes money from the register while he was getting beer at the convenience store. Then the convenience store robber throws the milk to Peter. Peter catches it, and then he runs off. Of course, the store clerk basically says, "Stop that dude!" But Peter, and then tells Peter a little help. Then Peter said, "Not my policy." And then the thief ran towards Uncle Ben after he dropped his gun. And he and Ben, well, Ben tries to get the gun before he does, but then Ben ends up getting shot. Peter then finds his uncle's dead body and then tells everyone to call an ambulance. But it was too late for that. Peter soon sees the wanted poster of the man he let go from the grocery store. And the most key distinction for this thief, he has a star on his arm. A tattoo of a star on his arm. So, we see Peter that night, or we see Peter go down a dark alley and confront a man mugging a woman who basically has blonde hair like the criminal that he let go, but instead he basically tries to see if the guy was the same guy, but ends up having to deal with a whole bunch of other thugs who begin chasing him down. Yeah. This whole thing revolves around Peter wanting to catch the crook who killed his uncle. I get that's Peter's motive of why he's going after the blonde-haired mid-30s guys who basically look like the thief or got the same description as the thief, but he's not able to catch the same guy though. After the chase, Peter came across an old abandoned wrestling arena where he saw a poster of a red mask, which gave him the idea to make a mask of his own. And he also began making equipment of his own with web shooters. Yeah, we get this whole montage of Peter slowly assembling his costume and everything he needs to fight crime. And because of Peter's actions as Spider-Man, he's also being hunted by the police, led by Captain George Stacy, played by Denis Leary. Now I gotta say, best parts of this movie, Denis Leary as George Stacy. He was a great police captain in this movie, so I cannot give Denis Leary any crap for that. He definitely does well playing this wisecracking police captain who's just trying to bring down Spider-Man, as well as protect the citizens of his fair city. And he's also Gwen's father, which that also adds more drama to things. Yeah, and Gwen also invited Peter for dinner. And of course, don't forget, Peter also confronted a car thief. Well, remember that executive I told you about where Peter, the same executive that dropped that file and Peter followed him at Oscorp Tower. Well, this same executive told Curt Connors that time is of the essence and that we must begin human trials, but Connors refused. And, well, the executive decided to take the serum to the Veterans Hospital in Brooklyn just so he could find test subjects, since veterans tend to lose limbs in battle. Of course, Connors tests the serum on himself, and slowly but surely, the serum works, and he manages to grow his arm back, but it also had more side effects by slowly turning him into a giant lizard man, or just called the Lizard. So, after having a awkward dinner conversation with Gwen's father, while being at Gwen's place for dinner since Gwen invited Peter, the two yet again have a moment on the roof of Gwen's apartment. And Peter reveals to her that he's Spider-Man. And she's like, oh my god, I am so in trouble. And then the Lizard goes on a rampage on the Williamsburg Bridge. I love how these movies of The Amazing Spider-Man wanted to use iconic landmarks as, as big superhero battles and moments. And this moment on the Williamsburg Bridge being under assault by the Lizard was just awesome. You see Lizard tossing cars, and then when Spider-Man arrives, he's catching the cars using his webs. He saves a kid for almost falling to his death. And it's just an awesome scene, seeing Spidey just web those cars to the bridge to save them. So that was pretty cool. Of course, the Lizard retreats into the sewers, and Connors reverts back to normal. But of course, Connors gets the idea to inject himself by upping the dosage of the serum. Yeah, he begins to inject himself with more of that serum stuff. Alright, so I'm not trying to go over the whole entire plot of this movie, but of course, Peter and Gwen talk at school about the mysterious lizard that Peter saw on the bridge. And so Peter tries to go and ask Connors about it, and then finally puts two and two together to realize Connors is the Lizard himself. Peter tries to warn Captain Stacy, but Captain Stacy is very skeptical to believe Peter. Yeah, part of him wants to believe Peter, but the other half of him just, yeah. But he still insists on one of his officers to give him a file on Curt Connors anyway. So, Peter goes into the sewer, and it is there the Lizard attacks him. And the fight between Spider-Man and the second time Spider-Man and the Lizard fight, the Lizard gets the upper hand on Peter as he's much more stronger than the last time. And we see him injure Peter by scratching Peter across the chest. Peter manages to get away, but retreats to Gwen's house. The Lizard finally sees a camera that Peter has, with Peter having a label on the camera that says "Property of Peter Parker." Peter retreated to Gwen's house, and Gwen treated his wounds. And yeah, they do more flirting. They do more flirting in this movie. And Gwen and Captain Stacy talk about Gwen's fantasy of her having a chocolate house that Gwen kind of told her father about. So, Peter and Gwen do eventually sneak out after Peter tells Gwen that I have to be the one to stop him. So, the next day at school, Connors arrives at Midtown High and attacks the school, and attacks Peter. Of course, Parker fights back and suits up into his Spider-Man suit. And the two begin to fight yet again, and this fight was just as good as the last one. The whole entire school fight was just awesome, especially Stan Lee's cameo in this whole scene as he's playing the school librarian, and the librarian is just listening to classical music as a giant reptile man is fighting a costumed hero in the background. That was just golden. Like, Stan Lee didn't need to say anything, but his just small role in that whole cameo was just awesome. So I gotta give kudos to the late Stan Lee in that cameo. So Stan Lee definitely had the best moment in that entire movie, even if it was brief. But anytime you watch a Stan Lee cameo, it's always going to be a good scene. Especially just how funny Stan Lee can be. Especially how he's just a man that can just ooze humor. And he doesn't even need to say anything to be funny. I mean, that was the genius of that entire cameo scene. Okay, so the lizard retreats into the sewer. Spider-Man's on his tail, following him. Peter comes across Connors' sewer lab, or sewer lair, where he sees a video that Connors posted on his computer, where Connors says, I realize that human beings are weak, pathetic creatures, and that I wanted to create a world without weakness. But instead, I realized that I need to create a new species. So, yeah, driven by his own madness and his own mad science, Connors decides to take the disease and disperse his lizard serum over the entire city so everyone would be just like him, by using this disbursement device that Oscorp built. Peter follows closely behind the lizard, and we see the lizard coming up Main Street as he's fighting against the entirety of the NYPD's SWAT team. We see the SWAT team try to fight off the lizard, but then they get infected by the serum as the lizard's unleashing the serum on them. Of course, Captain Stacy's full attention happens to be on Spider-Man, as he's trying to capture Spider-Man, because he's also viewing Spider-Man as a criminal as well. They manage to hit Peter by electrocuting him with a taser shot. Of course, as the police surround Spider-Man, Peter gets unmasked and he begins fighting back against the SWAT team. Of course, Captain Stacy tells Peter to put his hands behind his head, and then Peter turns around and they lock eyes, and he's like, Parker, and he's telling Captain Stacy that Gwen is at Oscorp and we have to stop him, and Peter tells the captain, you gotta let me go, please. And well, right as Peter's about to take off, the captain tells one of the officers to hold his fire, but Peter ends up getting shot in the back of the knee. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised Peter's spider sense didn't alert him to the bullet that shot him in the back of the knee like that. We see that the same guy, we see a crane operator and a whole bunch of crane operators operate cranes to line up for Spider-Man. What? I'm making a video. So, the crane operators begin operating cranes all around the city to give Spider-Man a clear approach to Oscorp Tower. The lizard begins climbing up Oscorp Tower to use the disbursement device. He's loaded the serum into the disbursement device. But of course, Gwen, who was at Oscorp, made a cure. So she tells her dad to get the cure to Spider-Man. Spider-Man and the Lizard begin fighting on top of Oscorp Tower, and I gotta admit, it is an awesome final battle, just them fighting on top of Oscorp Tower, as the Lizard's going to inject the city with this serum that he's going to disperse in the air with this air disbursement device. But then Captain Stacy comes in to help Peter after his web shooters get crushed. And then, as the captain's putting up a fight to distract the Lizard, he gets impaled by the Lizard's claws. Then Peter begins working his way up towards the top of the tower, and he gets the cure into the disbursement device. The disbursement device goes off with the cure, dispersing the cure, curing everyone who is infected by the Lizard's serum. Of course, right before Peter could fall off the tower, since his web shooters were crushed, he gets saved by Connors. Yeah, Connors, who was just trying to kill him, just ended up saving Peter. Ended up saving his life. I mean, okay. So, Peter goes over to Captain Stacy, who had just been hit by the Lizard's claws and impaled through the chest. And in his dying words, he told Peter that he's going to make enemies and that he had been wrong about Peter. And told Peter to leave Gwen out of it. So after that, a funeral was held for George Stacy, captain of the NYPD. And Peter told Gwen that I can't see you anymore, and Gwen puts two and two together, realizing that her boyfriend made a promise to her dead father right before he died. So, of course, at school, after the funeral, Peter began to hear the voicemail left behind by Uncle Ben the night Uncle Ben died. And one last time, Peter sees a ginormous spider symbol on a wall that was painted on, and he saw Flash wearing a Spider-Man shirt of his own. And, of course, Peter goes through one last swing around the city through Chinatown. Right after he had just told Gwen by whispering in her ear, but yeah, promises you can't keep, those are the best kind. Anyway, this has been The Amazing Spider-Man. Final thoughts? I think it's an alright film for what it was. I enjoyed the film back in 2012, and I still kind of enjoy it nowadays. Would I say it's one of my favorites? Well, I wouldn't say it's number one, but I would give it a watch every now and then. Anyway, this has been your Digital Super Saiyan 3, and I'll see you next time.